everyone. It is Chris Valesky and Ginger Hansen from the Empowered Body Club. Today, we're going to be talking a bit about what's ruining your health. And especially today, we're going to be talking about the cardiovascular system. And I mean, not just the heart itself, but the cardiovascular system as a whole. I mean, the literal delivery of blood, oxygen, and nutrients through every part of your body, from your brain to your heart, your organs to your fingers, your joints, tendons, and ligaments. Basically, how all of that is working and how all of that suffers from the different things that we do during our lives that we can actually have some impact on, and things that we can have an influence to really dramatically improve our health as a whole throughout our whole body. So, Ginger, let's kind of take off a little bit here. We've covered this subject quite a lot with our patients, but what do you think some of the key factors are here that are really plaguing the population as a whole when it comes to cardiovascular health?
So yes, let's start by setting some foundation. So the cardiovascular system is a very, very extensive network of blood vessels consisting of arteries, veins, and also smaller vessels such as capillaries. So I would like to show an image here to make that point more clear. So take a look at our
Wow.
cardiovascular system and see how extensive it is. If you were to line up all of our vessels, it would go around the earth over 2 times. Look at the head, look at the organ system, and how extensively vascular it is. And this is our transportation system for our nutrients. Everything gets delivered through the cardiovascular system. And by everything, I'm talking about oxygen, I'm talking about gasotransmitters, I'm talking about nutrients, macros and micronutrients. I'm talking about various hormones that we have. I'm talking about cells, white blood cells, healing cells. So everything literally flows through our cardiovascular system. And when we are born, our cardiovascular system is brand new. So it functions very well. And as we age, that cardiovascular system also ages. And what that means is that the transportation system for the delivery of all of these nutrients and cells is going to be lowered, right? So when our cardiovascular system takes a hit because we have some acute condition, like some trauma to our body, or if it is being taxed by emotional stresses that is going to put our body into fight or flight, or if it is being stressed by poor nutrition, such as processed foods, that are going to increase our insulin response, that are going to make our cardiovascular system and our blood more thick and more viscous, and creates a lowering of that effectiveness of the delivery of all of those cells, our body's going to suffer. Systems are going to start getting taxed. They're not going to work as well as they did originally. And over time, we're going to start feeling signs and symptoms throughout our body.
I think the really interesting thing to look at here, I mean, obviously we can see like the massive difference in the sizes of these blood vessels. I mean, like you see the aorta coming out there, the ascending and descending aorta, and it's just huge. But then you get out into like the arms and legs and you see how small these little capillaries get, or like, I mean, you can't really even see the capillaries because they themselves are basically microscopic. And it's an interesting thing to point out. We have this tendency to focus on the heart itself, which of course is very, very important. But when you start thinking about these structures within the body, like our knees, our elbows, all these tendons and ligaments, and how important it is that we get adequate blood flow to these things, because what tends to happen as we age, we start to get stiff, our joints start to fail us. You see how often people are getting things like knee replacement and hip replacement surgeries, and we come to realize that it's actually kind of difficult to get adequate blood flow into these structures, especially the fine structures that support the joints themselves, especially as the blood gets thicker and more sticky as we age, or as we get inflammation in these, we actually start to basically cut off blood flow into these key structures. And some of the thing I notice most frequently, our patients will say that they'll want to get up in the morning and they feel incredibly stiff, and it takes them like a half an hour. Some of our fibromyalgia clients, it'll take them sometimes an hour or two just to get their body loosened up enough to where they can even move properly. I mean, what do you like? Let's kind of look at some of those factors that are really contributing to those issues.
Yes, I think in our modern world today, nutrition is huge in impacting our
Big
cardiovascular
time.
system big time. Today, what's normal is eating processed foods, right? We've moved away from a society that eats, 1 to 2 ingredient foods to eating foods that have a label with multiple ingredients. And
And non-food
usually
ingredients too,
and
right?
non-food ingredients. We can't pronounce it. We don't know really what it is, right? And then they're hidden behind the rules and regulations of food labels as well. So of course we get confused. And of course, the food industry is going to push their agenda on us, and things become normalized. What's normal today was not normal 100, 200, 300 years ago. The consumption of sugar that we have today is not what was back then. The consumption of salt and bad fats is not what it was back then. So, what happens in the process of processing these foods is that foods get heated up and anatomically change their structure. And what do we add to make these foods yummy and delicious? We add
Sugar, yeah.
salt, sugars, and bad fats. And then, preservatives and other chemicals and food coloring and so on. So, of course, sugar, we know that that's going to cause glycation in the blood. That's going to cause an increased insulin response. And every time we have a heightened insulin response, it's literally like an emergency situation in the body. The body has one hormone to deal with that. What is it? Insulin, right? It's basically designed so that it can deal with the sugars in the body. It takes the sugars out and puts it into the cells, right? So that we can utilize. But if we have an excess amount of that, what's going to happen is those sugars are going to be turned into fat for storage, because our blood, it wants to maintain homeostasis. Even if we eat, an excess amount of sugar for an extended time, what's going to happen is our blood wants to maintain homeostasis. It's going to take all that sugar out of our blood so that it can operate again. Same thing with salts. Where does salt come from, right? That was a commodity back in the day. But today, we add it without questioning that belief that salt should be added to our foods. And what that causes is, a retention of water. And we're not eating enough potassium today, which is going to counter the salt in our body because we're not eating enough of the vegetables and the 1, 2 ingredient foods. So what happens is we have these sugar responses, we have these inflammatory responses, we have an excess amount of salt in our body, which leads to water retention, and it causes inflammation throughout the whole body. And with the heat, which is the cardinal symptom of inflammation, our body doesn't function the same. Heat is going to rise in the body. We're going to have hyperactivity in our brain. We're going to have red shot eyes. We're going to basically think and overthink. We're going to have a louder voice. We're going to feel just a sensation of heat in the body, which is basically just the yang rising, right? Which is technically
Big
means
time.
to us heat. Yang is basically heat. It's not some energy, some woo woo thing, but it's just literally heat in the language of Chinese medicine.
That's really huge. I mean, you talk about, this huge insulin response. And of course, after over time, our cells don't want to take this insulin anymore. It's called insulin resistance. And then it starts to stay in the bloodstream. And what nobody talks about is how highly inflammatory this process is. Having all that insulin in there is like, it's like putting sandpaper inside your blood vessels. It's just creating inflammation like crazy. And then we talk about, fluid retention. When we typically people only look at this when they're swelling, when they've got things like edema. But there are signs of swelling all over the body. I mean, not just salt, sugar, MSG is another huge one. And this completely mars up the pathways in the body. I mean, we talk about there's something called aquaporins in the cells, and they're responsible for helping regulate fluid in and out of the cells. And when the cells become too swollen, basically these pathways in the body stop working properly. And then we actually find things like thyroid problems becoming huge with this. And that, we're trying to take things like to increase energy, try to stimulate more energy, but we've got cells that are just at the bursting point with all this fluid. And the last thing in the world they need is to try to produce more. We need to actually get this out of the body.
Yes, and these chronic issues, they don't happen overnight. Just because we go to the doctor and the doctor said, hey, you're diabetic, all of a sudden, this didn't happen overnight. They say it actually takes 3 decades to create diabetes in the body. And now the trend that we're seeing is that it happens younger and younger and younger people, right?
Big time.
People in their teens, they're experiencing full blown diabetes type 2. And according to the CDC, 50% of adults over 18 have either diabetes or pre-diabetes. So there's this trend going on in our society, and it's basically coming from these unquestioned, subconscious beliefs that we have from growing up, that we get from society, that we get from the media, that we get from the food industry, and that penetrate the belief system of our families. And until we question that belief, which often happens only after we start experiencing health issues, all of a sudden we start looking at sugar. And so there's also this trend going on in society today about fearing carbs. Everybody is fearing carbs today. Why? Because of this blood sugar issue, because of this diabetes issue and cardiovascular issues that are going on in our society. But the truth is that it's not really the carbs that are causing this trend to happen. It's really the processed carbs. It's not the rice, right? As an Asian, I grew up eating
Yeah, high
rice and I
fructose corn
never.
syrup, sugary drinks and things.
Exactly. It's sugary drinks, it's processed rice, it's, processed grains. It's not just a simple 1 2 ingredient foods that we're eating. And so it's years in the making. It starts, inflaming all parts of our cardiovascular system. It changes our cardiovascular system. It puts more strain on the heart because when that blood is viscous, when it's thick, when it has all these
Mhm.
bad fats, when it has injury against the cardiovascular walls, that blood flow is not going to flow. It's going to be sluggish. And the heart senses this. And what it does is it compensates for this sluggishness in our cardiovascular system. And that's why we have cardiovascular, heart enlargements going on in our society and just inflammatory blood vessels and so on. So that is a result of years and years in the making. And the first thing that are affected in the body because of this reduced circulation are our capillaries, right? If you think about a volcano and you think about this network of arteries and veins in volcano, the biggest arteries are always going to have blood. The heart is the most selfish organ in the system. It's going to keep a lot of blood and nutrients for itself. And
So it
that's
can keep
important.
working, basically. Yeah.
So it can keep working. So the other organs are going to fail first. The other functions are going to fail first. Our brain is not going to get enough of the nutrients that it needs and the oxygen, right? So that the heart has what it needs to survive, you know? So the capillaries that serve our extremities, that serve our bones and our ligaments and our tendons, the vessels that serve our vision, our hair,
Mhm.
our nails are going to go first, right? Because in that piping system, the big vessels are going to lead to the more important organs, whereas the smaller vessels, technically, I don't need my arm to survive, but I can't survive with my heart. So the vessels going into my arms are smaller and less important, whereas the vessels, the aorta, huge, because feeding that heart is so, so important. And that's why we find weakness in our tendons, in our joints, in our bones, but they can heal because they have this network of capillaries that feed them with all the essential nutrients and gastrotransmitters.
It's such a big topic, really. I mean, when we start to look at what some of the research will show behind this, what's one of the most common things that we see as we age, and we tend to gain a bit of belly fat, and of course, cortisol comes into play here. But if you really look at the research, some of the best research out there, it'll show that every extra 10 pounds of abdominal weight you gain will decrease your arterial width by like 50%. So if you're carrying all this extra weight, you're just like squishing these blood vessels more and more. So now your organs themselves are not working very well. And even looking further at some of this research, you mentioned like how our extremities don't really need blood flow near as much as our heart and our lungs, of course, do. And there was actually some research that came out a while back showing that people who had their legs amputated for one reason or another actually had better longevity scores than those who didn't, because what happens, this blood flow gets so poor in the extremities that what we get poor blood flow, we start to develop things like clots, which cause things like strokes and heart attacks. So if you've don't have those anymore, you don't have legs anymore, it actually decreases that risk so that you get better blood flow to the rest of the body. I mean, it's illuminating and kind of absurd both at the same time to see what this does to the cardiovascular system. So another thing that, I mean, diet has gotten a lot of attention, of course, because, we're about the most affluent we've ever been in the history of humanity. We can get food basically anytime, even when we don't have a lot of money, when we're considered poor, we typically have more than we need, especially from the standpoint of processed carbohydrate. But another big one, of course, now that's starting to get more and more attention is the stresses placed on the body. So I mean, this can be chemical stressors, it can be physical stressors, it can be emotional stressors. And I really like to key on the emotional side of it because, in this day and age, we are at such a heightened level of emotional stress. We've got such an incredible access to information that our brains are constantly overloaded. And we're constantly triggering this little fight or flight response within the body. And,
Yes.
and historically, we would have that, right? I mean, like if you were attacked or you came upon like some wild animal, it was like, okay, fight or run like crazy or die, and then once you were in safety, your body, you rested. And, that's the way we were designed, but we weren't designed to have these constant fight or flight scenarios. I mean, you look at like modern business, for example, you go into a stressful meeting at work and you've got these fight or flight hormones that are telling you to either run like hell or claw your way out of the situation, neither of which is conducive to maintaining your job, right? So you've got this fight or flight response that's still there. It's causing your heart to beat harder. It's shunting blood flow to your digestive system, so causing things like IBS, and it's driving all this energy into your muscles that are not allowed to fight. They're not allowed to run, so you become tense. How many times do we hear people say, "Oh, my stress goes into my shoulders"? Yeah, they get all this tension. And then you mentioned these gasotransmitters like nitric oxide. It starts to rise in the body. And when it's got no place to go, it starts to collect in places, of course, making the muscles contract, but it'll also start to collect around the nerves. And what does that do? It creates this huge amount of inflammation at the nerves, which actually causes literal damage to the nerves in the body, in the brain. And then over time, our ability to deal with stressors becomes less and less because our nerves are, quote, fried, literally being destroyed by this important gasotransmitter, which is just being created in an excessive amount. And to me, this is absolutely fascinating. This is why, of course, diet comes into play here as well, because if our stomach is working well, if our digestion is working well, we have better production of things like dopamine and serotonin, which actually helps us feel relaxed. It helps us feel well. But if we're torching our gut, we're going to have a greater tendency towards stress. And if we have more stress, it's going to shunt blood flow to our stomachs, to our digestion, and it's going to affect our ability to produce these powerful hormones that are actually supposed to make us feel well. I mean, you see the perplexity of modern society and all these conveniences that we have, but then you also see the detrimental aspect of these and how modern lifestyle is both great, but also we've got a lot of challenges to overcome, like diet, like um, our physicality,
Yes.
and how we have to start adjusting these things just to protect ourselves.
Yes. While fight or flight helps us survive, it doesn't serve us well. According to a Harvard study, 70% of our thoughts are negative, and only 20 to 30% of our thoughts are positive or neutral. What that means is that we're wired to scan the world for threats. And that's great because back in the day, the person that had the most fight or flight in their body, the most, adrenaline and stress hormones in the body had the biggest chance of survival, right? They would be able to protect themselves at night from being attacked by bears and lions. But the stresses that we have today are not survival stresses in a sense that it threatens our physical body. You
Hmm.
know, what happens when our body goes into fight or flight is that our sympathetic nervous system and all their functions is going to get turned on. And that means it's going to help us, get our body ready to fight a bear or run away from that bear, right? So blood flow will redirect from being in our cardiovascular system, sorry, being in our organ system to our muscles, right? Because we're getting ready to either fight or flight, right? We need to utilize those muscles.
Yeah, it's not time to digest then, right?
No, exactly. Not time to digest, not time to heal, not time to poop. At that time, it's go time. It's going to redirect our blood to our eyes. It's going to redirect our body function to get more oxygen into our tissues. Same thing to help us fight or flight. What's not happening during that time is our body's not regenerating. It's not thinking about digestion. All of those parasympathetic issues, sorry, parasympathetic functions are basically being put on hold while we deal with the stresses. Now, what happens if stress becomes chronic? If we are always anxious, if we're always dealing with level 9, 10 of stress,
Hmm.
is that our body lives in that chronic state. And that chronic state of fight or flight, it's taxing. It's taxing on oxygen, gastrotransmitters. It's taxing on nutrients. It's taxing on all kinds of healthy cells that help our body regenerate. So we can't regenerate. We're living in the state of chronic fight or flight, and our body is just dealing with this constant battle internally, and it's not reaverting the right cells to where it needs to be, right? It's basically always a war that we're fighting. It's never ending, and we don't have enough resources for our other things in life.
You know, it, it brings up a really good point, about thoughts, right? And one of the reasons that we've made adjusting thought processes and literally adjusting how our brains work as sort of a central thesis in the way that we address our patients, right? I mean, like, sure, we've got excellent medicine, we've got excellent access to diet, but we have to be able to rewire how the brain works. We have to literally create new and stronger pathways to how we actually think. We talk about fight or flight, but one aspect of this, a third aspect of this process that oftentimes might get ignored, is that there's a freeze potential within this adrenal response. So it's actually fight, flight, or freeze. And I know this sounds like a bad thing, right? Like, you're in a dangerous situation and then your body just locks up. But there's actually a very important survival mechanism that comes into play here. I mean, if you're an animal and you're attacked by another animal, they very often, if you were to watch videos of this, you'll see the animal just go still. And it's almost like it gets this very blank look because it's actually going into a freeze adrenal response, which is actually shunting blood flow to these areas so that if they do get a gash on one of their limbs, that they don't bleed out. And then their brain actually releases very, very powerful endorphins to blunt all that pain so that they're not hurting. Basically, it allows them to remain still. Now, we do see this in a lot of people who've suffered some very severe traumas. Whether it's like a near death experience, something very, very scary, and then again, it affects the cardiovascular system. Basically, everything is always tense. And they almost become seemingly apathetic, like they become very, very blank, melancholy, depressed all the time. And it's again another aspect of this nervous system damage. You get locked in this state of freeze, basically, instead of a fight or flight constantly. And again, that has a very similar impact. They're cold all the time. They struggle with insomnia. There's no energy, there's no liveliness to the life. And of course, it starts to have these same degradative effects on the body, just like these other issues that we're talking about.
So, how do we deal with these stresses in our patients? So, one thing that I wanted to mention is when you have a stronger health foundation, you're going to be able to deal with stresses more effectively, right? So, when you're eating right, when you're living a healthy lifestyle, when you exercise, your foundation for health is going to be greater, and your ability to deal with stress is going to be greater as well. From a mindset perspective, Chris, and I know you like to talk about gratitude, so I'm bringing it up.
That's a big one.
Yes. How do you go about dealing with some of these emotional stresses?
You know, Gratitude is a big one, because gratitude, when you put yourself in a state of gratitude, it basically acts as an antidote. to these negative emotions. And when I say negative emotions, they are usually fear, anxiety, and then anger are big ones. But when you're in this state of gratitude, of thankfulness, of feeling like, wow, I have these great things. I've got a great family, I had a great meal, whatever it is. It's like it's like taking an antidote to a poison. Because when you have these thoughts, these repetitive thoughts in your head that are constantly saying negative things, it literally starts to poison your mind. And the more your mind is on a specific activity, the more that part of your brain grows. I mean, there's great research on this showing that, like in monkeys, where they teach them to use one finger to perform a specific task, that area of the brain would grow by something like 600%. So, what do you think happens if you're just constantly worrying about money, or constantly worrying about what other people think, or whatever it is, whatever negative thought process that plays over and over again in your brain? Now, if we flip that and start to bring in a state of gratitude over and over and over again, your brain literally starts to think differently. It starts to build new pathways. So now, when you're out in the world, when you're with family, with friends, when you're dealing with whatever situation, your brain quite literally starts to function differently. And over time, the ability for you to handle these stressors and to overcome these things becomes much, much greater. I've got a great example. As practitioners and as people that run businesses, we deal with stressors nonstop. And sometimes these stressors are hard to deal with. And I remember it was a few weeks ago, I had a very difficult situation that I had to deal with. Um, and it was very hard. And I got done with this situation, and I'm thinking is like, oh my gosh, I'm not in a great state. I've got meetings, I've got patients. What am I going to do here? And the thought hit me. I'm like, turn the lights off. And I used some of these tools for dealing with these stressors. It took me all of about 2 minutes, and I completely changed the state of my physiology, my emotional state, and I went on with the rest of the day. And I took care of everything that needed to be taken care of. 2 minutes was all it took with these tools, because I've taught my brain how to do this. And I truly believe anybody can do this if they're willing and they put in the effort.
Yes, I remember you sharing with me this situation, this particular
Yes.
situation, and I remember you were hyped up about it, and you snapped out of it like this.
It was
So,
like the snap of a finger.
and it's not normal to be able to snap out because we are conditioned differently. One of the important distinctions that you were able to get to was your ability to rewire your brain previous to that. You
Yes.
basically were able to make these new neurologic connections. You were able to change your subconsciousness, right? Like your consciousness of gratitude became subconscious because it was so automatic, and in that moment, you were able to refer back to that. Because if those pathways had not been established, you wouldn't be able to so easily revert to it, right? So
Exactly.
what's
Yep.
important is to habituate these new emotions, habituate these new neural connections, and make more connections to these neural connections so that they become the dominant kind of thought patterns in your brain, and they all of a sudden become subconscious. And if you do this enough and you do it with intensity, that is going to be the way, because our brain is like a machine. You train it like a monkey, right? Those conditioned behaviors, they have to be conditioned, because an unexamined mind basically will just revert to what it does, negativity. It's just like weeds growing, and they don't need any encouragement. This negative voice in our brain does not need any encouragement, just like weeds. They don't need water, they don't need food, they need nothing. They just grow. So if you want to grow a rose garden or a rose bush, you actually have to be intentional about how you manage that plant. And same way, we want to manage our brain. We want to build that foundation, that subconsciousness that's going to allow us to revert to that state no matter where we are, with just, either automatically or just by becoming conscious of what's going on and examining those beliefs and whether they're true or not. I love Byron Katie's 4 questions, where she basically allows us to flip any set of beliefs that we have that are causing stress in our body and in our, physical, emotional being.
It's huge. You know, I I really think you're right. I mean, when we start to talk about this idea of habituation, I mean, that can go either direction. Everything in our body creates basically some kind of a feedback loop. Like if your gut is thrown off, it'll cause brain problems, brain or emotional problems, and then that will in turn cause gut problems. So it becomes this sort of degrading downward spiral. Now, if we change that and we train our brains, train our bodies, train our ways of reacting to these situations, we can create a spiral that occurs the opposite direction. What does that look like? It starts to look like health. It starts to look like longevity or the ability to take care of oneself. I mean, we have these situations, these stressful moments in life, and we all have them. It's unavoidable, but our bodies will start to crave something from that. We will have what we call human needs. Human needs psychology, and we'll start to look for what our need is in that instance. Very often it's that we need some kind of comfort, so we turn to things like bad food, or some kind of unsavory practice, maybe drugs as an example, and these just beget this downward degrading spiral. However, if we understand, okay, here's what my body needs right now, here's what I'm seeking, if we can find a way to satisfy that same need in a way that is actually constructive, we flip that cycle around. So even though we have a stressor which might throw us, we can adjust these habitual practices in our lives so that they will not only fulfill our needs, but they'll actually bring elevate us to a state of optimal health and optimal wellness, and of course longevity as the big piece of that.
Yes. And returning back to the blood flow, as I said earlier, when our sympathetic nervous system is elevated through fight or flight, our parasympathetic nervous system and our body's ability to heal is going to be mitigated. It's going to be reduced. So we want to make sure that we have that foundation with emotional well being to feed our physical body, especially in today's modern time and age. It's so, so important to have some tools that can help us effectively take care of our emotional well-being so that our body doesn't suffer. um, in terms of the third stress, and I think you mentioned chemical stress, Chris, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Um, Really, we can look at this in a number of ways. Of course, we have such a greater access to environmental chemicals. That's a big one, especially when you start to look at your house. You get into that quote new house smell. That's a big one. You're smelling chemicals. We're exposed to a lot of these things a lot more. Things found in paints. Another big one is molds that we are exposed to. I took a trip to Chengdu, Sichuan province, a couple years ago, and one of the first things I noticed was that the environment itself was extremely hot and extremely humid, and there was mold everywhere. I mean, it was inescapable. So as a society, like the society as a whole, adjusted their diet and they cook with things that are totally antifungal to combat this. But this is another one that puts a huge strain on the body, and something that can really affect the brain in a big way. These chemicals cause an enormous amount of inflammation in the body. You know, even things that we cook with, Teflon and these other coatings that make things non-stick. We find that some of these things take sometimes years or even decades for our body to actually get rid of these things, and it behooves us to be extremely mindful of this kind of thing. And of course, following these good practices, because in order for our bodies to actually get rid of these things, we have to be in a state of health. And if our kidneys are bothered by having to excrete this extra fluid because we're carrying all this extra fluid because of MSG and salt and sugar, and our livers are taxed already because we're taking, ibuprofen and acetaminophen constantly because we hurt because our blood flow is off, we can't get rid of these things. We can't address these things. And they start to put us again in this state of toxicity, in this state of fight or flight. And it can drive this exact same type of process of shunting blood flow, affecting our nervous system, and basically just causing this cycle of decay over time. I think you have more to add to that, don't you?
The cycle of decay, as we have agreed on, is basically the decay of our cardiovascular system. More strain on our heart, more stress on our, the blood flow, more strain on our blood vessels. That's going to impact and reduce circulation, that's going to impact and reduce the bioavailability of our nutrients and our ability to absorb them into our bloodstream and to deliver them to the areas where they're needed. Once our circulation reduces, especially in certain areas, especially in our extremities, especially in the areas that are served by our capillaries, our feet, for instance, right? Gravity is going to take our blood flow down. How about back up? If we're having an impacted cardiovascular system, if we're having viscous blood, if we're having a heart that's already stressed out and not able to circulate all of the nutrients through our cardiovascular system, how
Hmm.
are we going to get our blood that are pooling in the feet to go back up? So that's why diabetics who have a blood sugar issue, who have insulin resistance, can't heal in the feet. And that's because they just don't have the nutrients available for healing, the blood cells that they need, the proteins that they need, the oxygen and gas transmitters that they need. It's just not available. So when that circulation is reduced, guess what's going to happen to the flesh over time? Guess what's going to happen to the bones in the feet over time? They can't be regenerated. Our body regenerates. Not every single part of our body, but most of our body gets regenerated. The person that you are today was not the person you were last year
Hmm.
from an anatomical perspective, right? Because our old cells will die off and they get replaced by new cells. But in order for us to be able to replace those old cells with quality new cells, what do we need? We need the building blocks of those very cells. With our digestion being attacked with the modern diet, we can't absorb properly. If we can't absorb properly, where are those nutrients going to come from? I like to say that we're not breatharians. We can't just live off of air. You know,
You're in sunshine,
we
right?
exactly. We are physical beings. We live in a 3D world. So those building blocks have to come from somewhere. So when those building blocks are not available over time, degeneration. It literally means that the bones, the flesh, the tissues, the cells, their quality is going to go down, and we're going to rebuild tissues that are inferior to the quality that we had before.
Yes, a cycle of decay.
Cycle of decay. Here's the
Yep.
cool thing: our body can heal. We all know this innately in us, right? We don't have to tell the tree to heal. We just got to give it what it needs. We have to obey the laws of nature, right? Fix the cardiovascular system, fix the digestion, stop, putting stress on our body chemically, physically, emotionally, right? So that our body can start absorbing those nutrients again. It can start functioning again the way it's supposed to. And we can literally shave off a couple of years off of our age, right? Because when the body senses that it has the nutrients again that it was once, craving, and the body doesn't judge. It doesn't say, okay, you know, we don't have good nutrients, so we're going to use bad ones. It's just going to use whatever is available, right? It doesn't judge that whole process. It's just what it is, right? So once we get the better nutrients in, once we get circulation to work again the way it's supposed to, we can start regenerating again. We can rebuild a body that is a lot more resilient than it is today by obeying the laws of nature.
And it's a really good point because we've been conditioned that we are just going to get old and decay, right? But if you really comb the research out there, I mean, research showing that nerves can heal. I mean, we can recreate and we can repair nerve damage. We can repair damage to the brain. I mean, we've seen reversal of even things like degenerative neurological conditions. We've seen research that shows that your body can regrow cartilage in the knees. I mean, I had a patient about a year or so ago that had nasty varicose veins, and we got rid of them. Gone. This is without surgery. This
Naturally.
is the body healing itself. I mean, you've seen this too, Ginger, where we have some of these people that will have cardiovascular workups and show all these big blockages in their arteries. And then they go back, 6 months, a year later, and these blockages will decrease by 50, 75% because we put the body into a state where the body heals itself. The body is capable of incredible amounts of healing and the type of healing that would almost seem miraculous, but it's the body is capable of it. We just have to set the environment up so that the body can actually do it.
That seems so strange, Chris, because
It's a
that's not,
foreign concept, right?
it is a foreign concept because today we are conditioned to believe otherwise. Today, we're conditioned to believe that when we're diabetic, it's going to be a lifelong condition and we have to submit ourselves to insulin shots, glipizide, metformin, and all these different, glucose management drugs. But food is the problem in the case of a diabetic. So food has to be part of the solution. If we are allergic or sensitive or intolerable to sugar, to processed sugar, then we can't keep that in our diet because that's the problem. So we got to find a way around it, and it needs to be customized to the person, of course, right? So we are not medical doctors, by the way. So everything that we say is based on our own experience, and we're not telling you to stop your drugs, by the way. We're not telling you to all of a sudden change your diet and remove the sugar. I don't want you to put yourself under any kind of risk. But what I do want to get across is that there are ways for us to have a healthy body, for our body to heal, for our insulin resistance to improve. That is totally possible, but it just depends on what our belief system is. If we believe that, hey, our body is, able to heal, and we question the other beliefs that say it's impossible, right? Even with fibromyalgia, Chris, right? We treat fibromyalgia patients all day long. And these are patients that have been told for years and maybe 5 decades, even for some of our patients, that there's nothing that they can really do
They just have to
but
live with it, right?
prescribing pain meds. And if pain meds were working, that would be a miracle, right? But somebody who's taking pain meds for decades, and the meds are no longer working, where do you go from there? What are the other options? And that's generally how people find us. They try everything that, regular, practitioners have told them, have prescribed to them. And over time, it stops working. And they end up in a situation where, okay, the meds aren't working. They've tried this, they've tried everything. And now where do you go from here? So that state, sometimes you have to have these painful experiences to be able to reset, push the reset button and take care of yourselves. You and I ourselves, what really got us to take action? It's when we were at the depth of our despair that we
Big
said,
time.
okay, no more. I hit rock bottom and I can't go down further. So where do I go from here?
Really, I mean, that mindset, that idea there, I mean, that's really why we named the program the Fibro Warriors program, right? Not the Fibro Sufferers program, because it is about the ability to question that, the ability to say, like, no, I'm not living this way. I am going to fight it. I'm going to be a warrior for my own health. I'm not going to just accept this status quo. I remember we had this gentleman a few years back, the highest blood sugar I had ever seen. He was on 5 medications for it. A1C was 13.3. I looked at him and said, how are you alive? I just don't get it. How you're even surviving. It had to be mental or something. Um, but we dropped him from 13.3 down to 6. And that's off. And he got off every one of these medicines. And that was $5,000 a month worth of medicine. 5 grand a month worth of medicine.
Yep.
And now, I mean, the blood sugars were better once off it. I mean, to me, it was mind blowing. And when we see things like this, we see the ability of the body to come back from such a terrible extreme. I mean, it just goes to show really what our bodies are capable of and how much healing is really possible. That's
Is
why I really believe in this idea of a health warrior, because it is somebody that's willing to fight for themselves and willing to say, like, no, I will not accept that. And I'm going to figure out what it takes no matter what to get
That's the
myself where I want to
mindset.
be.
Yes, that's the mindset that is required. It's not selfish to take care of your health. It's not selfish to love yourself and make time for yourself, but it's necessary. It's like the heart. The heart is the most selfish organ, and it's necessary because you got to put that oxygen mask on yourself first on the plane before you can inspire others, before you can take care of others effectively. Otherwise you build the resentment when we're taking care of other people first, of our, the needs of our work first, the needs of our family and our friends and so on. What we don't take care of necessarily is ourselves. And especially for women, for women who have children, that's a huge, huge topic. Some of our fiber warriors are mothers,
Big.
and they have been just spending years and years taking care of their families. And they get to a point where they can't do that anymore. So it's important to recognize that taking care of oneself is not selfish. It's a requirement, really.
You got into this concept, you brought up this idea of yin and yang. And I mean, this is really lifestyle practice here. I mean, choosing to take care of everybody else is like throwing it all out there. And what happens to your body? It becomes too yin. It starts to decay. It gets heavier. It gets more water accumulated. I mean, literally, just it starts sinking itself down to the earth until the yin and yang completely separate, and that's the end of it. So
Yeah.
we have to take care of ourselves. Think about how many more people you can help if you are taking care of yourself. How much more good you can do in the world if you are in a good state of health. This is one of the most important things that we do.
Yes. And the yin and the yang concept might be a little bit woo woo, but it's really, really the foundation of our work. And for us, the yin and the yang basically means that, there's a yin and there's a yang in everything. In a relationship, the man's the yang, the woman's the yin. And within each one of us, we have the opposite as well. I have some yin, my husband, I have some yang, my husband has some yin. And the way when we come together, it's basically the completion of the yin and the yang symbol. However, if each one, the yin, myself, and the yang, him, if we are each not complete, what's going to happen is it creates imbalance in the relationship, right? For example, when the woman is trying to take over all the tasks for the man, trying to make his decisions, trying to kind of overpower him or control him, the yin is going to consume the yang. Same thing in the body. When there's too much heat, too much yang in the body, what kind of symptoms are we going to experience? We're going to experience dryness. We're going to experience, since the heat flows up in the body, we're going to experience these sets of heat symptoms, right? The red eyes, the loud voice, super red ears, a red flushed face, insomnia, hyperactivity, overthinking, and so on. And it's basically the separation of the yin and the yang as well, right? Too much yin or too much yang does not serve us. We want to kind of play. It's never going to be 50-50, right? But we always want to play within the range that is healthy. Like a back and forth is healthy. Yeah, makes sense? I know this yin and the yang concept is kind of a newer concept and kind of a woo-woo concept. And I think we'll make a video on that at some other time to explain those concepts and the different relationship rules a little bit more.